still I am hated. Now my blind eyes see what others cannot. That sometimes the hand of fate must be forced.
Hey buddy, watch this.
Yeah, let's talk about Illidan Stormrage, one of the most iconic characters in Warcraft lore, but his Hearthstone card pretty underwhelming, something that's never seen any sort of competitive play. Tried it myself multiple times, just can't seem to make it work. A little bit too slow, health is a little too low, the upside just hard to work with. So Illidan is left as a beloved character that's just never seeing any action in Hearthstone. And I think that's a real shame because there are some really simple tweaks to this card that could make it playable, that would improve it just enough to give it a reason to live in some decks in Hearthstone. Now, of course, I know Blizzard is not known to go around buffing cards, but why not? Maybe this will inspire them, and I'm even going to toss out one idea that would be a total re-envisioning of Illidan Stormrage, maybe for a future expansion. So perhaps some easy ways to buff it, perhaps a totally new way to bring Illidan to life in a new card and in a new expansion. So let's see how you can fix this card. Up first, I think, is the most obvious and ridiculously simple change that would take 2 seconds and would make Illidan substantially more playable. Just swapping its attack and its health numbers so that Illidan has 7 health instead of 5. That means as a minion itself, suddenly pretty decent stat line that trades favorably into a lot of things as opposed to just dies. And we see this same sort of stat allocation with the card Violet Teacher at 4 mana, which at the end of the day is actually a pretty similar card to Illidan. For both of them, you do something and you summon some guys. But Violet Teacher, because it's so much cheaper, that makes it a far more efficient kind of card, and the sort of card that's seen various competitive decks in its life. It's been included in all kinds of things like Token Druid in the past, whereas Illidan Stormrage at 6 mana, just too slow, doesn't have that same survivability on board, really hard to work over multiple turns. But if you buff the health to 2, suddenly it might live for a turn or 2, suddenly you can snowball it, and because it's cards, not just spells, that means the upside's even higher. So that tiny little change, making it survive to a little bit more, direct damage spells, survive to trades, just make it trade into the board nicely, that could be the difference between Illidan seeing no play and seeing at least a little bit of play. Regarding stat changes, another thing that could make this card go a long way is buffing the Flames of Azeroth that Illidan summons. So instead of just making them 2/1s, what if they were 2/3s instead? And you might be thinking, whoa, that's a pretty big change. That makes those minions, going from, whirlwindable or pingable threats to pretty sticky, survivable threats. And you're right, but I think a substantial change is necessary. You really do have to up the power level here because Illidan himself is very unlikely to hang around. So you need each card summoned off Illidan or each minion summoned off Illidan to do a little bit of work. And 2/3s are substantially stickier and can take trades. And if you think about cards like, Hogger, for instance, Hogger is a 6 mana 4/4 that summons 2/2s with Taunt. Now, the upside is not there for Hogger because it's just limited to 1 per turn. Illidan could theoretically summon a bunch more per turn, but it's not totally out of the realm of reason. And again, Hogger's not a great card. If we want Illidan to be playable, we have to be better than Hogger. And I think this version would do exactly that. So suddenly just getting 1 Flame of Azeroth might be worth it with Illidan. Still a lot worse than things like Spiteful Summoners, right? But because that upside's there, we could get 2, 3, or 4. Illidan starts to make a lot more sense. So I think it'd be a completely fine change that would make Illidan playable. Another easy fix here is just reduce the mana cost of Illidan. You can chop down his stats a little bit too if you want to give him less attack, but making him hit the board sooner gets him a lot closer to that Violet Teacher space as opposed to competing with other really powerful late game cards. So a 5 mana 5/5, we know that stat line is completely fine in Hearthstone. So many cards can succeed as a 5 mana 5/5, and you still retain a lot of the upside for Illidan, particularly as you get into the late game. You just have more spare mana laying around after playing Illidan, so maybe that allows you to squeeze in one extra card or 2 extra cards so that you can get some extra Flames of Azeroth. Now, the Flames are still fairly susceptible to lots of different sorts of removal, but the more affordable Illidan becomes, the better he fits into that style of play. Maybe some token decks can utilize him. So just getting him out a tad faster could go a really long way. Up next, we have another version here with another small, easy tweak. What if Illidan was a battle cry instead of a summoned condition? So almost making Illidan live in that like Dr. Boom space where you just get a pile of dudes for, 6 mana. You get a nice 7/5, that's a threatening minion, and you get a couple 2/1s to boot. Now, I still think this would be substantially worse than Dr. Boom because the Flames of Azzinoth would not be as good as Boombots, but he's a little bit cheaper, still a solid stat allocation, makes Illidan feel a lot better to play. You could just curve him out on 6 as well. You don't feel bad like you have to play other things alongside him to get that extra value. So it just adds some consistency and reliability to Illidan. Still maybe not, the big time superstar card, but certainly better in things like Arena, for instance, better off random effects, and just a more consistent place. And then finally, I have one other change to Illidan as we know him here with the Flame of Azzinoth instead of Illidan himself. What if he looked the same, but we made the flames better instead of just making Illidan better? And in this case, because the Flames of Azzinoth in the Illidan boss battle from Burning Crusade had a lot of different AoE style effects, I thought, why don't we make the flames themselves have some AoE aspect? So what if we gave them also damages the minions next to whomever this attacks? Pretty common effect in Hearthstone. A handful of different cards have that, but suddenly these little 2/1s become much more threatening. Instead of just doing 2 damage, they could do like up to 6 and trade really efficiently into board, so they become threats to your opponent's minions. This is in some ways similar to the 2/3 aspect, but it makes one of these pack a little more punch and look a little more threatening. So your opponent has to respect the threat of the Azzinoths perhaps a little more than they otherwise might. I considered some other things too, like, giving them Death Rattle Whirlwinds, like Tentacle of N'Zoth, but that doesn't do very well if you have multiple Flames of Azzinoth, so there's some problems there. But just giving them some area of effect upside so that they themselves become threats, so once your opponent deals with Illidan, you still have something of value on board. Now, I know all those were super duper simple ideas, not hard to think about at all. But again, that's kind of the goal, is how easily you could tweak Illidan to make him better. But I wanted to add in something a little extra special. What if Illidan were to come back in a future expansion as the star of, a Legion or Burning Crusade themed expansion? And what if he were a hero card? That, I think, would give Illidan the weight and significance that he deserves. So I made a 10 mana Illidan hero card, and in fact, I made it neutral. Something we haven't seen yet. What if Illidan is that neutral legendary star like we've seen with Lich King in the past? So for this version of Illidan, we have a Balak right here that reads, equip the War Glaives of Azzinoth, his famous weapons that you could get in World of Warcraft. They were like the cherished treasure every DPS, melee DPS class wanted. They would be a 4/4 weapon with Wind Fury that reads, after attacking, summon a 2/1 Flame of Azzinoth. So what that means is on turn 10, when you played this, you'd get to do 8 damage to the board, whether that means trading into a couple minions or dealing 8 to your opponent's face, but you'd also get a couple 2/1s. So a reasonable enough play, I think, for 10 mana. Not a great one necessarily. It's going to be susceptible to aggro decks and such, but it still gives you enough immediate impact to be competitive. And some upside too on this weapon. If you can do things like buff it into extra durability, you could turn it into a pretty monstrous threat. It is a 16 damage weapon that also summons 4 minions, but still susceptible to weapon removal. Now, the hero power here I think is pretty cool. It's called "You Are Not Prepared," which is Illidan's like famous line. And it's a passive hero power that reads, at the end of your turn, swap your opponent's hand with cards from their deck. Now, the idea here is that your opponent won't be prepared when they go into a new turn, because as soon as that turn flips over to them, they're going to have all new cards to look at and work with and figure out. So they're literally just not going to be prepared because they didn't have time to plan ahead for their next turn. Now, that might not seem like an inherently strong thing because it's not actually doing anything, right? It's not like destroying resources or minions or summoning things. There's no inherent value there, but I do think there's a considerable amount of like psychological disruption value, because again, they don't get to plan, they have to think on the fly. That might create some options or some problems. Beyond that, there is some true hand disruption value as well. For instance, if your opponent's like a combo deck and they've been holding on to 3 combo cards the entire game, when you play Illidan, you might move those combo cards into their deck and give them other garbage they don't necessarily want. So they might have to find those combo cards again, and it's hard for them to like hold on to resources in hand or create a scenario where they draw into all their combo stuff simultaneously. So basically, you're combining that, psychological advantage with in some ways like a real disruption advantage. And I think it's just a fun play on the "you are not prepared" line from Illidan. Now, you know, that is a sacrifice because you're not getting other good hero powers. You're not getting like armor ups every turn, or, you know, Gul'dan's lifesteal ping every turn. Those are direct and impactful hero powers. So Illidan, that's by design, because this is a neutral hero card. You can't give it anything like too crazy or that synergizes too well with any given deck or class. So it has to be something that just kind of fits in. The weapon can be benefited from something like rogues, or, you know, with weapon buffs, or warriors with weapon buffs can work with the weapon perhaps a little better than other classes. But the hero power doesn't seem as exploitable. It truly feels like sort of a neutral, disruptive kind of threat. But I don't think every deck would want to run this, right? Like aggro decks could for the raw damage, but they might not be able to afford a 10 drop. Control decks, it doesn't necessarily add any like late game value. So the sort of decks that run it are just going to have to decide when it's worth it or not. Now, is this the perfect Illidan design? No, of course not. There could be all kinds of cool ones and better ones and things that use different aspects of the character. But the idea here, the core element is like, let's get Illidan back in the game. I don't know if it's actually worth it to fix the version of Illidan we have now. That'd be amazing if they went in and buffed him just to recognize the character. But if they don't, let's get a new one that's awesome and big and the star of an expansion, because I think Illidan is a character that deserves that sort of card. Now, all that said, I'm curious, what do you guys think about Illidan? You're all going to say, Blizzard never buffs cards, why even talk about it? Well, I just first off think it's fun to talk about, but why can't they buff cards? Like, who cares if they do? I'd love to encourage that. So maybe a video like this inspires someone over there to do exactly that, and Illidan gets a second lease on life. That'd be amazing. But if you do think that's possible, or if you want to see that, what do you think Illidan should have that would make him better? Does he just become a 7/7, for instance? Is that another variation? Do you totally change him and make him a 10 mana card with 5/5 summons? I don't know. I want to hear your thoughts. So share your take on Illidan in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.